Jody left the Rice's fruit stand. She headed up this hill, which was at that time called Penny Creek Road. Her body was later found in the woods on the Rice property, where Alan and his dad came to Hudwood. That day, they'd already dropped off one load at the house and went back for a second.
My recollection is we drove the truck back to where we were cutting and had gotten out of the truck and just had barely just gotten started when in came a bunch of police.
August 23rd, 1972, a warm afternoon in Snohomish County, Washington, northeast of Seattle, and Judy Loomis had a small decision to make. She was 20 years old. She kept a horse at a stable, a few miles from the family home. And most days, she drove out there. But not this day. The sun was high, the roads were quiet. So she made one ordinary choice. She took the bicycle instead. And before she left, she borrowed her little sister's boots, Jana's waffle stomper boots. A small thing, the kind of thing nobody thinks twice about. Hold on to that detail, because almost 5 decades later, that pair of boots becomes the entire case. She rode out around 5 o'clock, turned onto Penny Creek Road, white 10-speed bike, open sky, a route she'd taken plenty of times. Now, here's what you have to understand about this place. In 1972, this part of the county was barely settled. Horse properties, dirt roads that led nowhere, long stretches with no neighbors in sight. It was the kind of place where people simply trusted the space around them, where a 20-year-old could ride alone on a sunny afternoon and feel completely safe doing it. That detail matters, not because it's pretty, but because it's exactly why nobody saw this coming. About halfway to the stable, a narrow dirt track split off the main road. It ran straight into dense forest, easy to miss if you weren't looking. That track is where the afternoon stopped. Around 5:30, a young couple drove up the same road. They'd come out to do some target shooting. Cans in the woods, nothing unusual, but they never fired a shot. Because they found a woman on the ground. She had been attacked. She had a single gunshot wound to the head, a small caliber round, a .22, and she was still alive, barely, unresponsive, but breathing. The couple didn't wait. They got her into their car and drove toward the nearest hospital, about 15 minutes away. She didn't make it. Judy Loomis was pronounced dead on arrival. Now, watch how investigators read that scene. Because in 1972, the scene was all they had. The evidence told a clear sequence. She'd been forced off the road, at gunpoint, moved off the track and into the trees. The shot came near the very end, and the physical evidence was right there. Her white bicycle, left at the exact spot where she was stopped, the point where the ride became something else. Her clothing was collected from the scene, carefully, piece by piece, and among it, the waffle stomper boots, the ones she'd borrowed from Jana hours earlier. All of it was sealed, logged, sent to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, into long-term evidence storage. And here's where the contradiction begins. Because on paper, this should have been a solvable case. Think about what they actually had. A real crime scene, not a body dumped miles away. The original location, intact. They had the victim's bicycle. They had her clothing. They had the boots. They had a cause of death. And they had a specific weapon type, a .22 caliber pistol. That is a lot of evidence for any era, let alone 1972. And yet, watch what happens next. No fingerprints were recovered from the scene, none that pointed anywhere. There were no witnesses to the attack itself. No one saw who turned down that track. The couple who found her arrived too late to see anything but the aftermath. Their names were never even released to the public. So deputies did the only thing they could. They worked the area, knocked on doors, talked to the people who lived nearby, and a few names did come up. We'll get into exactly who. But here's the part that matters right now. Every promising lead fell apart the moment it was tested. No physical evidence tied anyone to the scene. No testimony held up. Nothing connected a single suspect to those woods. So sit with the size of that gap. A full crime scene. Real physical evidence. A dead 20-year-old woman, and not one lead that survived a second look. That is not how these cases are supposed to go. And it raises the question this entire story is built on. How does a case with this much evidence go absolutely nowhere? That's the question that's about to swallow the next 3 decades. Before we go further, understand what you're watching. This is the case that sat untouched, longer than Judy was even alive. Filed away and walked away from. That's what we do on this channel. We dig up the ones the system gave up on. So if you want to be here, when the next forgotten case finally cracks, subscribe right now. These are the stories almost nobody finishes telling. We do. Here's what most people get wrong about this case. They assume there were no suspects. There were. That's what makes 1972 so frustrating. This wasn't a blank page. Deputies had names within days. Let me walk you through them, because this is the part of the story that quietly decided everything. In the days after Judy died, and here's the detail that put him on the list. He had behaved inappropriately toward Judy before. Not once. It was the kind of conduct neighbors had noticed for years. The kind people talked about quietly, but never formally reported to police. So on paper, he looked like a real possibility. Local, known to her, a documented pattern of crossing a line. The second man was a tenant. He rented on a property nearby, and on the afternoon Judy was killed, he'd been seen chopping wood, close to that same dirt track. When deputies pressed him, he couldn't clearly account for his time. Couldn't lay out where he'd been, or when. Now stop and think like an investigator. You have a man with a history near the victim, and a man who can't explain his afternoon right beside the crime scene. In a lot of eras, that's enough to build pressure, maybe enough to break someone. Both men were questioned. So were several others in the area. Deputies worked the human angle hard. The way you had to in 1972, and then it all collapsed, because suspicion isn't proof, and in this case, suspicion was all they had. Nothing physically tied either man to those woods. No testimony placed them at the scene. A bad reputation isn't evidence. An unaccounted for afternoon isn't evidence, and deputies knew it. So one by one, the suspects fell away, not cleared by some dramatic alibi. Just never connected. The link simply wasn't there to find. And this is where you have to understand the era, because the real problem in 1972 wasn't the detectives. It was the toolbox. Think about what forensic science could actually do back then. They could analyze a wound. They could identify a weapon type. A .22 caliber pistol, in this case. They could collect clothing, bag evidence, store it carefully, and they did all of that. But here's what didn't exist yet. DNA profiling. As a crime-solving tool, it simply wasn't there in 1972. The science was years away. The databases were decades away, so even if a killer left something of himself behind, there was no way to read it. Sit with that for a second. The answer could have been in that evidence already. And no technology on Earth could have pulled it out. That's the quiet tragedy of this case. It wasn't that they failed to collect. They collected plenty. It's that the evidence couldn't speak yet. It was sitting in storage, holding its secret, waiting for a science that hadn't been invented. So by the end of 1972, the case had nowhere left to go. The leads were exhausted. The suspects were gone, and there was nothing new to chase. The county's freshest homicide became its most frustrating one, a full case, and not a single thread that held. So the file went dormant, onto a shelf, beside every other case the system couldn't close. The detectives who worked it moved on. New assignments, new crimes. That's how cold cases are born. Not with a decision to give up, but with a slow, quiet running out of options. But here's the thing about a cold case. Somebody always keeps it warm. And for the Loomis family, there was no moving on. Jana was 12, old enough to understand exactly what happened, young enough to carry it her entire life. And in that house, grief didn't fade. It set in place. Like furniture nobody moved. They kept Judy's bedroom exactly as it was, for a long time after she died. Jana would later say, "You could still smell the patchouli oil. When you walked in, her leather purse stayed right where she'd left it. On the last ordinary morning of her life, nobody touched it. Nobody could. That's character depth you don't need words for. A frozen room. A purse left in place. A family living around an absence." Judy's parents aged through the years that followed, and they did one thing over and over. They called the sheriff's office, asking for updates. But the updates never came, because there was nothing to update. Nothing new, year after year after year, and eventually, Jana became the single voice of her family, the one who kept the file from being forgotten, the one who refused to let it disappear. That matters more than it sounds right now, because a case only stays alive if someone keeps saying the name. So picture the full situation. By the time the trail had gone fully cold, you had an evidence room, full of carefully stored material, and you had a family, asking a question no one could answer. Everything they needed was already in that evidence room. They just didn't have the eyes to see it yet. In 2005, one detective decided to look again. 33 years is a long time, long enough for a case to be forgotten by almost everyone. But the evidence room hadn't changed. The boxes were still there. The boots were still there, exactly as they'd been sealed. What had changed was the world outside that room. In 2005, a cold case detective pulled the file. His name was Jim Scharf. Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, and the case he pulled was the oldest unsolved homicide in the county. 33 years on the shelf. Most people would call that a lost cause. Scharf didn't work that way. He was methodical, almost stubborn about it, and he made a decision early. He wasn't going to skim the file. He was going back to the very beginning, treating it like the crime had just happened. So here's what he actually did. He went through the original evidence piece by piece. He re-interviewed people. Anyone still alive, anyone still reachable. And the key move, he sent anything with DNA potential to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for modern testing. Remember why that matters. The science that didn't exist in 1972 existed now. The evidence had been waiting for exactly this. And there was one more change. For decades, the family made the phone calls. Now there was a detective calling them. Then came 2008, and the moment the whole case turned on. A crime lab technician was examining the boots, the ones logged back in 1972, and she did something simple. She looked at them under different lighting, with modern equipment, and she saw something. On the outside of the left boot, a biological stain. Small, easy to miss. Now think about what that means. That boot had been in evidence the entire time. Handled, cataloged, moved between facilities, examined more than once across 3 decades, and nobody had ever seen it, not one investigator, across multiple agencies, for 36 years. It took the right lighting and the right technology to reveal what was sitting in plain view. So now they had biological material, and in 2008, that meant one thing. They could try to pull DNA. Let me slow down here, because this is where the science matters. DNA from a crime scene isn't always a clean read, especially when it's decades old. Time degrades it. Handling degrades it. The sample breaks down. So when the lab worked the stain, they didn't get a complete profile. They got what's called a partial profile. Here's the simple version. A full DNA profile reads many specific markers, enough to be essentially unique. A partial profile reads fewer of them. It's still powerful. It can still identify someone. It just gives you less of the picture, like a fingerprint with a few ridges worn away. But a partial profile was enough to do the next step, and the next step was a database. This is where you need to understand CODIS, because almost everyone gets it wrong. CODIS is the FBI's national DNA database. And here's the part that matters. It is built from convicted offenders. The principle is simple. If someone is convicted of a qualifying crime, they submit a DNA sample. That profile goes into the system. So when you have crime scene DNA, you run it against that database. And if the person is in there, the system flags a match. That's it. That's the whole engine. It only works if your suspect is already in the system. So in 2008, they entered the profile from the stain on Judy's boot, and they ran it through CODIS, and the result came back. No match. Sit with how strange that is. They had the killer's DNA, pulled from a 36-year-old boot, and the database had nothing to say. Now, here's the trap people fall into. No CODIS match feels like a clean record. It is not the same thing. A no match only tells you one thing. This person's DNA was never entered into the system, and there are real reasons that happens. Maybe their crimes came before mandatory DNA collection laws. Those laws are relatively recent. Anything older simply wasn't captured, or maybe their offenses didn't fall into the categories that required a sample. Not every conviction puts you in CODIS. So a man could have a long, troubling history and still never appear in that database. CODIS would stay silent, not because he was innocent, but because the system never collected him. And that is exactly what happened here. But Scharf didn't shut it down. He did the smart thing. He left the profile running, because CODIS isn't a one-time search. Once your profile is entered, it's automatically checked against every new offender added. Every time someone new was convicted and their DNA went into the system, it was quietly compared to Judy's case. So the profile sat there, working silently, year after year. Nothing. 2012, nothing. 2015, still nothing. 10 years of automatic checks. 10 years of new names entering the database. And not one of them matched the stain on that boot. So understand where that leaves the investigation. This isn't a story about a failed test. The science worked perfectly. It read a killer's DNA off a 36-year-old boot. It just couldn't tell them his name. For that, they'd need a completely different kind of database. So they stopped looking for the killer and started looking for his family. That sounds backward, but it's the single idea that finally cracked this case. July 2018. Scharf tried something the original detectives never could. He sent the DNA profile to a private lab. Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. Parabon specializes in one thing, a technique called genetic genealogy, and it works on the exact opposite principle of CODIS. Remember, CODIS searches for the criminal himself. It only works if he's in the system, and this man never was. Genetic genealogy doesn't care about that. It isn't looking for the offender, it's looking for his relatives. Here's how it actually works. Stay with me, because it's clever. You take the crime scene DNA profile, and you upload it to public ancestry platforms, the same kind millions of people use, to trace their own family history. Now think about how many people that is. Ordinary people, voluntarily submitting their DNA to learn where they came from. If any of them share enough DNA with the crime scene sample, it means one thing: they're biologically related to whoever left it. You won't get the killer directly. He never uploaded his DNA, but a cousin might have, a distant relative he's never even met. And that's the doorway, because from a relative, you can start building outward. This is where Parabon brought in a specialist, a genetic genealogist named Deb Stone, based in Oregon. Her job was painstaking. She took the distant DNA matches that came back, and she started building a family tree, branch by branch, generation by generation. And she did it using nothing but public records, census documents, court records, marriage and death records, old family trees posted online. This isn't a computer spitting out a name. This is human research. Slow, manual, relentless. Deb Stone spent 57 hours on this one case alone. 57 hours of cross-referencing, tracing births, following marriages, mapping where families moved and when, and slowly, the branches started to converge, narrowing from a huge web of relatives down to one specific family, in the Edmonds area of Snohomish County. But here's the limit of the method, and it's an important one. Genetic genealogy can point to a family. It cannot tell you which member of that family did it. A family tree isn't a confession, so they had a name to focus on. But suspicion still isn't proof. We learned that lesson back in 1972. To close the case, they needed his DNA directly. A clean, undeniable sample from the man himself. And you can't just ask, not without tipping him off. So investigators did it quietly. August 28, 2018. They followed him to the Tulalip Casino north of Everett. And they simply watched. They watched him buy a coffee, sit down at a machine, drink it, and throw the cup away. The moment he walked off, they moved in and pulled that cup from the trash. Think about what's on a used coffee cup. Saliva, DNA, legally discarded, no warrant required. The cup went straight to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The same lab that had read the boot, and now they could do the one test that genealogy could never do, a direct comparison, the cup against the stain. September 2018, the result came back. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Judy's boot, and the odds of a coincidence? 980 million to 1. Stop and let that number sink in. A coffee cup in a casino trash can. He drove over the curb onto the front lawn and slammed the brakes. If you want to see how this holds up when it actually reaches a courtroom, subscribe right now, because what the defense does next very nearly erases all of it. You do not want to miss that fight. Now, the name. His name was Terrence Miller. Everyone called him Terry. And here's the detail that stops you cold. He had been living 5 miles from the crime scene the entire time. For decades, he ran a small ceramics business out of his garage. He called it Miller's Cove, a retired heavy equipment operator. Quietly growing old in Edmonds. To his neighbors, to his customers, he was just Terry, the ceramics guy. That was the version the world saw. But court records told another story. And it only lands now, because now we know it's him. His history stretched back before Judy's death. In 1968, at 18 years old, he married a 14-year-old girl. Around that same period, he pulled a company truck alongside a teenage girl and exposed himself to her. He admitted it to police and was cited for lewd conduct. And the concerns didn't stop after 1972. Over the following 3 decades, he faced multiple separate accusations of sexual misconduct. The outcomes varied. Some allegations were later walked back. One fell outside the statute of limitations. After that first citation, none of them led to a conviction, and that single fact explains the dead end in Chapter 3. No convictions meant no DNA sample. No sample meant no CODIS entry. No CODIS entry meant 10 years of silence. He didn't beat the system, he simply never entered it, and there's one more reason he stayed invisible. In 1972, his name never came up, not once, not on a single list. Because deputies were focused on 2 kinds of men who knew Judy personally, and men seen near that track. Terry Miller fit neither. So while a county searched for years, he stayed completely out of view. 5 miles away. So now they had everything. His name, his DNA, and a number that left almost no room for doubt. But a match on paper isn't a conviction. And the defense was about to put 48 years of evidence handling on trial. For 46 years, no one knocked on his door. That finally changed on one morning in 2019, April 11th. Deputies arrived at his home in Edmonds and arrested him for first-degree murder. He was 77 years old. The man who'd stayed invisible for decades was finally in custody. But here's something that surprises people. He didn't stay in a cell. Bail was set at $1 million. He posted it and went home, back to the same house, to wait for trial. And that trial would not be simple, because understand what this case had become. It was never going to be won on the crime scene alone. There were no eyewitnesses to bring forward, no confession, no murder weapon tied to his hand. The entire case rested on one thing: the DNA. So the trial wasn't really about what happened in 1972. It was about a single question: could that DNA evidence be trusted? The trial was delayed more than a year, partly by the pandemic. Partly by the defense fighting the DNA itself. They tried to get the genetic genealogy thrown out. In October 2020, a judge refused. The evidence was allowed in, and the trial could finally begin. It ran about 2 weeks. Snohomish County Superior Court, Judge David Kurtz presiding. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They built the entire case around the DNA chain, and they walked the jury forward, step by step. The stain on the boot, the profile developed years later, the genealogy that pointed to a family, the discarded cup, the lab confirmation, and the number, 980 million to 1. Every link laid out in order, a clean line from a boot to a name, and then the defense went to work, because they had a strategy too. And it was sharp. They didn't try to explain the DNA away. They attacked how it had been handled. Every single link in that chain. Listen to the argument they made. Because it was stronger than you'd think. Their case was about 5 decades of mishandling. The evidence had passed through countless hands. across multiple facilities, over nearly 50 years. They pointed to the 1972 autopsy. Deputies there had not worn gloves. By modern standards, a serious problem. They pointed to gaps in the record, evidence that had been unaccounted for during long stretches of those decades, and they pointed to the lab itself. At one stage of testing, an analyst's own DNA had turned up. On a reference sample. Put it all together, the defense argued. The chain of custody was broken, beyond repair, and nothing pulled off that boot, decades later, could be trusted. That was the real fight, not whether the science worked, but whether the evidence had survived 50 years of human hands. And in the middle of that legal battle, one person stood up to speak. Jana. 48 years after she lent her sister those boots. She stood in that courtroom and faced the man on trial. She spoke plainly about hope, about accountability, about what those decades had actually cost. She described the imbalance of it. The accused had gone on living a full life, holidays, a marriage, raising children, while her family lived around a wound that never once closed. No theatrics, just the facts of a life measured against a loss. Then the case went to the jury. Closing arguments wrapped on Friday, November 6th. The jury began deliberating. Then broke for the weekend, and here is the part that no one in that courtroom saw coming. Monday morning, November 9th, 2020, Terrence Miller was found dead at his home. He was 78. The medical examiner ruled it a suicide, but the timing is the gut punch. The jury did not know. That same Monday morning, they returned to the courthouse. They resumed deliberations. They weighed the contamination arguments. They measured 2 weeks of testimony, all of it, with no idea the defendant was already gone. And that afternoon, they reached a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. Think about what those 12 people did. They looked at evidence nearly 5 decades old. They heard every argument about mishandling, and they decided the chain held. The genealogy, the cup, the match. In their judgment, it all stood. But the story wasn't quite over, because his death created a legal problem. The defense filed a motion to vacate. Their argument was technical, but serious. He had died before the verdict was formally read, so he never got to appeal, and without that right, they argued the conviction should be erased, wiped from the record entirely. Judge Kurtz held a hearing that December. He listened to both sides, and then he ruled. He would not erase what the jury had found. The conviction would stand. So the verdict held. But sit with what the family actually received. There was no sentencing, no prison term, no moment of watching him led away in handcuffs. For decades, he stayed out of reach. And right at the very end, he stepped out of reach one final time. Now go back to where this started. Jana was 12 years old when she lent her sister a pair of boots. She was 60 when a jury finally said the word guilty. And both of her parents were gone by then. They spent their whole lives waiting, and died still holding the question. She heard the answer without them. But here is the fact that outlasts all of it. A stain everyone missed for 36 years is what named her sister's killer. The evidence sat quietly in storage, and it waited. It outlasted the original detectives. It outlasted a broken chain of custody. It outlasted the man himself. The evidence outlasted everyone who ever tried to bury it. A stain the size of a fingertip waited 48 years for someone with the right tools to read it. And there are thousands more sitting in evidence rooms tonight. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next one we open might be the one that's been waiting for you to hear it.